In May 2022, Brookhaven, a quiet town nestled in rolling hills and ancient forests, woke to a chilling discovery. Mark Reeves, a 35-year-old businessman, was found dead in his luxurious home. On the surface, it seemed like a tragic suicide, an abrupt end to the life of a man admired for his success and resilience. But those who knew him whispered about the days leading up to his death and the strange events surrounding his stay at Oakwood Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't just the shock of his death that sent ripples through the town. It was the haunting sense that something far more sinister lay beneath the surface. I've been a nurse at Oakwood for 5 years. My name is Lily Evans, and I've always prided myself on being able to connect with patients. Oakwood isn't just a rehabilitation center. It's a sanctuary for people trying to piece their lives back together after devastating injuries. Most patients come and go, their stories blending into the background of my routine. But Mark Reeves wasn't like the others. He arrived 6 months before his death, wheel-bound and cloaked in a silence that bordered on brooding. The accident that left him temporarily unable to walk had been a hot topic in the local news. A high-speed crash on a deserted highway that somehow hadn't killed him. He spoke about it rarely, dismissing questions with a polite but firm smile. Mark was the kind of man who carried his burdens alone, refusing to let them show. At first, I thought that stoicism was strength. Later, I realized it was something else entirely. Our interactions were limited to therapy sessions and routine checkups. Mark wasn't the chatty type, but there was a quiet sharpness to him, a wit that occasionally slipped through his reserved demeanor. I respected his boundaries and didn't press, though there were times when I saw something flicker in his eyes, an unspoken pain, a heaviness that words couldn't reach. I figured it wasn't my place to pry. But then the phone call started. It was subtle at first. He'd receive a call, glance at the screen, and let it ring out. No big deal. Everyone gets unwanted calls. But as the weeks went on, the pattern became harder to ignore. His body would tense up at the sound of his ringtone. He'd check the caller ID, and his jaw would tighten before silencing it. One day, during a therapy session, the phone buzzed again. He ignored it, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the wheelchair's armrests. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, gave me a small, bitter smile, and said, "Life's a mess right now, Lily." That was all he said. No elaboration, no details. I didn't push, but the unease lingered. There was something in his tone, something raw and fractured, that stayed with me long after the session ended. It wasn't just the phone calls that raised questions. Mark was private to the point of secrecy. I'd caught glimpses of letters tucked into his bedside drawer, always hastily hidden when I entered the room. On more than one occasion, I noticed him staring out the window with an intensity that made me wonder what, or who, he was waiting for. Then came the postcards. The first one arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Mark wasn't in his room, and as I adjusted the bed linens, I noticed a single card on the bedside table. It was unsigned, with a vague message scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Be careful who you trust." When Mark returned, he saw me looking at the card. His face darkened, and without a word, he snatched it up and shoved it into a drawer. I didn't ask about it, but his reaction spoke volumes. The second postcard came a week later. I didn't see it, but I knew something was wrong when Mark canceled his evening therapy session. Something he'd never done before. Whatever was happening in his life was closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it reached him. Or worse, reached us. Looking back now, I can see how all the pieces were already there, scattered like shards of glass waiting to form a jagged picture. At the time, though, I could only watch, trying to make sense of a man unraveling before my eyes. I had no idea how much danger was creeping closer, or how deeply I'd find myself entangled in it. The storm outside roared like a living thing, rattling the windows of Oakwood Rehabilitation Center. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the hallways into near darkness, broken only by the pale glow of emergency lamps. I was at the nurse's station, charting the day's progress notes, when I saw him. Mark's silhouette emerged from the far end of the corridor, his wheelchair gliding almost soundlessly over the polished floors. Even in the dim light, I could see how tightly he gripped the armrests, his knuckles white against the dark leather. His face, pale and slick with a sheen of sweat, was a mask of exhaustion and something else, something raw and fractured. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened in recent weeks, and his sharp, tailored features now seemed hollowed, as though he was being consumed from the inside out. He didn't notice me at first. His gaze darted from side to side, scanning the empty hallway like a man expecting an ambush. When his eyes finally met mine, I saw a flicker of recognition, quickly replaced by guardedness. "I didn't think anyone was still awake," he murmured, his voice low and hoarse. "I could say the same about you," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You should be resting." He gave a weak chuckle, though it sounded more like a sigh. "Rest doesn't come easy these days." I hesitated, watching as he turned his wheelchair toward the window at the end of the corridor. He stopped there, his back to me, staring out at the rain-soaked darkness. Something about his posture, rigid, coiled, made me think he wasn't just lost in thought. He was waiting. For what or for whom, I couldn't say. "Mark," I said softly, stepping closer, "is there something you want to talk about?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the storm. "Do you believe people can sense when something bad is about to happen? Like an instinct?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I said cautiously. "Why?" He turned to look at me, his eyes sharp and searching. "Just wondering." Then, as if catching himself, he added, "Ignore me. It's late, and I'm tired." But I couldn't ignore him. Not when his words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mark's unease seemed to grow with each passing day. He began missing meals, retreating to his room for long stretches of time. When he did emerge, he was more withdrawn than ever, his interactions clipped and tense. It wasn't just his mood. It was the way he moved, the way his eyes darted to every corner of a room, as if he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. Even during therapy sessions, he was distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. Once, during an evening session, his phone rang. He flinched at the sound, his hand trembling as he reached to silence it. I couldn't help but notice the way he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen before he finally rejected the call. "Who keeps calling you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He glanced at me, his jaw tightening. "No one important," but his grip on the phone said otherwise. The tension in his shoulders, the flicker of fear in his eyes. Everything about him screamed that whoever was on the other end of those calls was anything but unimportant. Another night, I overheard part of a conversation as I passed by his room. His door was slightly ajar, and his voice, low and strained, carried into the hallway. "I told you I can't talk right now," he was saying. "You don't understand. They're watching me." A pause. "No, I don't care what it costs. Just make it stop." I froze, the words sinking in like stones. Who was watching him? And why? The notes began arriving around the same time. The first one was waiting for me in my locker. A plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled hastily in uneven handwriting. "Stay away from him. For your own good." At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe a disgruntled coworker or a misguided attempt at humor. But then came the second note, delivered in the same unmarked envelope. This one was more direct. "You don't know what you're getting into. Walk away while you still can." By the time the third note appeared, I could no longer dismiss them as harmless. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of my car, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "Last warning." I showed the notes to the head nurse, but she waved them off as the work of a bored staff member or a prankster in the neighborhood. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. At night, I found myself glancing over my shoulder in the parking lot, my heart racing at every unfamiliar sound. The storm on the night of the power outage was one of the worst we'd had in months. By the time the lights went out, the entire building was bathed in an eerie half-darkness, the emergency lamps casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I found Mark in the therapy room, sitting in his wheelchair near the center of the space. The dim light made his features look even more gaunt, his skin pale and almost translucent. "Mark," I said, stepping closer, "what are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Have you ever wondered what it's like to feel trapped? Not physically, but in every other way." I knelt beside him, trying to meet his gaze. "Mark, if something's wrong, you need to tell me. I can help." He laughed bitterly. "No one can help me, Lily. Not anymore." The room seemed to grow colder as he leaned forward, his expression shadowed. "There's something I should tell you," he began, his voice trembling. "Something I should have said weeks ago." But before he could continue, the power flickered back on, the overhead lights flooding the room with sudden brightness. Mark flinched, his words cutting off abruptly. He looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and regret. "Forget it," he muttered, wheeling himself toward the door. "It doesn't matter." But it did matter. I could feel it in my bones. And whatever secret he was keeping was pulling him, and me, deeper into something dangerous. The next morning, I found another note in my locker. This one was different. Typed, not handwritten, and far more menacing in tone. "You've been warned before. This is your last chance." The words burned in my mind all day, their implication clear. Whoever was behind the notes wasn't just issuing empty threats. They meant business. And for the first time, I realized I might not be safe anymore. The tension around Mark had become palpable, threading itself into every interaction. His behavior, though quiet, was a loud testament to a man under siege. He avoided eye contact, his sharp focus dulled by exhaustion. His movements were quick, sharp, as though he were expecting something, or someone, to strike at any moment. One afternoon, as I passed by the therapy room, I saw him hunched over his tablet. His shoulders were tense, his fingers tapping rapidly against the screen. I lingered by the door, curious but cautious. The screen's glow illuminated his face, and for the first time, I noticed faint lines of worry that hadn't been there before. He seemed oblivious to my presence, so I leaned slightly closer, catching snippets of what he was typing. Asterisk, contact severed, operations delayed. No trace yet. Asterisk below, there was an email thread with no subject line, but the senders' names were redacted, replaced with cryptic pseudonyms like Observer and Vanguard. A faint vibration startled him. His phone, resting on the desk, lit up with an incoming call. Mark stared at it, his jaw tightening as the name on the screen blinked. Unknown caller. He didn't answer. Instead, he silenced the device, shoving it into his pocket with trembling hands. He exhaled shakily and turned, catching sight of me in the doorway. "Lily," he said, his voice strained but attempting nonchalance. "How long have you been there?" "Not long," I replied, stepping inside. "Everything okay?" Mark locked the tablet screen and placed it face down on his lap. "Just work stuff. Old habits." His words were clipped, dismissive, but the way his gaze darted to the door told me he wasn't just hiding work. He was guarding something far heavier. The internet wasn't much help at first. Search results for Mark Reeves were as polished as his professional demeanor, awards for excellence, glowing interviews, profiles on leadership. But the further I scrolled, the more the sheen began to dull. A headline caught my attention. Asterisk, high-stakes lawsuit threatens Reeves Holdings. Asterisk. The article described a former business partner, Howard Grayson, accusing Mark of corporate sabotage. Grayson claimed that Mark had used insider knowledge to ruin his ventures, forcing him into bankruptcy. The details were murky, with mentions of fabricated contracts, forged emails, and even veiled threats to Grayson's family. Though the case was settled out of court, the settlement figure was staggering, and Mark's reputation had been bruised, even if he'd managed to recover publicly. But what struck me most was the closing line. Asterisk, Grayson vowed to fight until justice was served, claiming Reeves's actions would haunt him sooner or later. Asterisk. Was this the shadow Mark was running from? Julia's sharp voice pulled me out of my thoughts later that evening. "You've been distracted all day. she said, placing her hands on her hips. Care to share what's on your mind? Julia had a way of getting answers, her no-nonsense demeanor tempered by a genuine concern that made it hard to brush her off. I hesitated, then said, "It's Mark. Have you noticed anything off about him lately?" Julia frowned. "Aside from him acting like a spooked animal? Yeah, I've noticed. Saw him in the parking lot last night, pacing like he was waiting for someone, or hiding from them." The image of Mark pacing under the flickering streetlights sent a chill through me. "Did he say anything to you?" "No," Julia replied. "He bolted as soon as he saw me. But there's something he's not telling us. Keep an eye on him, Lily." Her words mirrored the unease I'd been feeling for weeks. The black SUV appeared the next night. Its engine idled across the street from the center. The headlights dimmed, but the vehicle unmistakably occupied. I slowed as I approached the parking lot, glancing over my shoulder to see if anyone else had noticed. The tinted windows revealed nothing, but the presence of the vehicle felt deliberate, calculated. I fumbled with my keys, casting another glance as I unlocked my car. The SUV didn't move, but I swore I saw a faint glow inside, like a phone screen lighting up. The unease followed me home, and I found myself checking the locks twice before I could settle into an uneasy sleep. The storm came 2 nights later, violent and unrelenting. The power outage plunged the center into chaos, emergency lamps casting faint halos of light in the darkened halls. I moved quickly, checking on patients and making sure no one was panicking. I found Mark in the common room, sitting near the window. Lightning illuminated his face for a brief moment, and what I saw unsettled me. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, knuckles white. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fixed on the glass as though he expected something to appear on the other side. "Mark," I said softly, approaching him. "What's going on?" He flinched at my voice, turning to me with an expression I could only describe as desperation. "I can't stay here," he whispered. "It's not safe." "Why isn't it safe?" I pressed. Mark's gaze darted to the hallway. "They'll find me. They always do." The words were heavy with fear, his voice trembling. Before I could ask who they were, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Mark stiffened, his whole body tensing as the sound grew louder. "We can't talk here," he said quickly. "Not now." I turned to see Julia entering, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Mark didn't answer. He simply wheeled himself past her, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway. The next morning, a note was waiting in my locker. Unlike the others, it was typed, the words cold and impersonal. Asterisk last warning. Stay away from him. Asterisk. I stared at it, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a scare tactic anymore, it was a direct threat. And whoever was behind it knew exactly how to reach me. Determined to get answers, I waited for Mark after his therapy session. When he wheeled into the hallway, I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "We need to talk," I said firmly. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Lily, not now." "Yes, now," I insisted. "You're not the only one being threatened, Mark. I need to know what's going on." He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the far end of the hallway. Finally, he gestured for me to follow him. We ended up in a small, unused office at the back of the building. Mark closed the door behind us, his expression heavy with reluctance. "There are things about my past," he began, his voice low, "that I thought I'd left behind. But some people don't forget. And they don't forgive." "What people?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. "People I made mistakes with. Business deals that went bad. Partnerships I ended poorly. I thought it was over. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Now it's all coming back." Before I could ask more, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and silenced it without a word. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this." And with that, he left, leaving me alone with a head full of questions and a gut full of dread. Mark's decline had become impossible to ignore. His sharp features, once striking and confident, now looked gaunt, his skin pale and stretched over high cheekbones. Dark shadows framed his eyes, which darted nervously at every sound. He'd begun muttering to himself when he thought no one was around, his fingers tapping erratically against the arms of his wheelchair. His clothes, once meticulously neat, were rumpled, as though he'd slept in them, or hadn't slept at all. When I entered his room that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was the heat. The blinds were shut tightly, the windows closed, and the air felt oppressive. Mark was by the window, his back to me, the faint glow of his phone casting a ghostly light on the walls. His hands were shaking as he gripped the device, his thumb hovering over the screen like he was debating whether to answer a call or delete something. "Mark," I said softly, stepping inside. He flinched, quickly locking the phone and shoving it into his pocket. Turning to face me, he forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Lily," he said, his voice hoarse, "didn't hear you come in. You should open a window," I said, keeping my tone light. "Feels like a sauna in here." "I like it that way," he muttered, sitting back in his chair. He picked at the edge of his sleeve, avoiding my gaze. I hesitated, then stepped closer. "Mark, you can talk to me. Whatever's going on. You don't have to deal with it alone." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or resignation. But then his phone buzzed again, and the tension returned to his face. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and pressed a button to silence it. "Is it them?" I asked quietly. Mark froze, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Don't," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to." Before I could respond, he wheeled himself to the desk, where his tablet sat open. As he scrolled, I caught glimpses of emails. Snippets of frantic conversations with vague, ominous phrases like "target confirmed" and *escalation imminent. A subject line caught my eye. Grayson, update required. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Whatever this was, it had consumed him. That night, I lingered near the staff entrance, watching the parking lot. The black SUV was there again, parked just across the street, its engine idling faintly. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching. Keeping to the shadows, I moved closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The vehicle didn't move, but as I approached, the faint glow of a phone screen was visible inside. I squinted, trying to make out more details. A face, a hand, anything. But the SUV's headlights flashed on suddenly, blinding me. I stumbled back as the engine roared, the vehicle speeding off into the night. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stood there, watching the red taillights fade into the distance. Julia found me in the break room the next day, a file folder clutched in her hands. She'd been quiet about her investigation, but now her expression was grim, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Lily," she said, her voice low, "we need to talk." She spread the contents of the folder on the table. There were photocopies of old newspaper articles, screenshots of emails, and a photograph of Mark sitting in a restaurant with another man. The caption identified the man as Howard Grayson. "He's tied to organized crime," Julia explained. "Grayson's been meeting with people who don't just ruin lives, they end them. If he's after Mark, this is more than a grudge. It's a vendetta." I stared at the photograph, the weight of her words sinking in. "Does Mark know?" "I don't think so," Julia said, "but he's right to be afraid." That evening, the storm returned, and with it, the power outage. The center descended into chaos as emergency lights flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the hallways. I made my way to Mark's room, my steps quick and purposeful. He was sitting in the dark, his phone pressed to his ear. His breathing was shallow, his voice low and frantic. "I told you I can't do this anymore," he was saying. "They're too close. You promised I'd be safe." I stepped closer, and he whipped around, ending the call abruptly. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here, aren't they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't answer. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. "You don't understand. If they find me," he trailed off, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "Grayson," I prompted. His head snapped up, his gaze sharp. "How do you know that name?" "Julia found some information," I admitted. "Mark, we can't help you if you don't tell us the truth." He hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "Grayson thinks I betrayed him, that I took something from him. But I didn't. He's using me as a scapegoat. And now he's made me a target." The words came out in a rush, his voice thick with desperation. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "Because it won't stop him," Mark said bitterly. "Grayson doesn't operate in the open. He has people, powerful people, who do his dirty work for him. And if they think you're helping me," he didn't finish the sentence. But the implication was clear. A loud bang echoed from somewhere in the building, and Mark froze. His eyes locked on mine, filled with panic. "They're here," he whispered. A low, resonant bang reverberated through the building, its deep timbre carrying a metallic edge that suggested it wasn't just something falling. It was purposeful, deliberate, like a door slammed shut with force or a heavy object hitting a wall. The sound sent a jolt through my chest, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. Mark froze in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His wide eyes darted toward the door, his breath quickening as though he'd just run a mile. The storm outside had dulled to a steady drumbeat of rain, leaving the echo of the noise to linger in the silence that followed. "Stay here," I whispered, though my voice trembled. Mark looked up at me, his expression a mix of fear and resignation, but he didn't argue. I slipped into the dimly lit hallway, every sense heightened. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, their faint hum amplifying the eerie stillness. The air felt charged, thick with tension, and my steps were slow and deliberate, each one echoing faintly against the tile. I moved toward the source of the sound, my ears straining for any other clues. The metallic smell of rain seeped in through the cracks in the doors, mingling with the faint antiseptic scent that usually filled the hallways. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of the building's generator pulsed steadily, but it did little to drown out the pounding of my heart. As I neared the back exit, the door was ajar, the soft patter of rain audible beyond it. My pulse quickened, and I pushed it open cautiously. The storm greeted me with a gust of cool, damp air. Outside, the parking lot was shrouded in mist, the rain blurring the outlines of the few cars parked under the flickering streetlights. And then I saw it. Mark's wheelchair, empty, left abandoned near the edge of the lot. "Mark!" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the rain. My stomach twisted as I scanned the lot, my eyes darting between the shadows and the pools of light. The storm blurred everything, making it harder to distinguish movement from the swaying of tree branches in the distance. A faint scraping sound drew my attention, and I turned toward the treeline. There he was, his figure hunched, struggling to wheel himself across the uneven ground. The rain plastered his hair to his head, and his jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, soaked through. I ran to him, my feet slipping slightly on the wet pavement. "Mark, stop. What are you doing?" He didn't respond until I reached him, crouching beside him. His breathing was ragged, his face pale and streaked with rain. He looked at me with an expression I could only describe as desperation. "I have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's not safe." "You're not safe out here," I countered, gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "You can't just run. They'll find me," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the parking lot. "They always do." Before I could press him further, the rumble of an engine cut through the rain. I turned, my breath catching as headlights pierced the mist. The black SUV emerged like a phantom, gliding silently into the lot before stopping several yards away. Mark's entire body tensed, his hands gripping the armrests so hard I thought he might snap them. "Lily," he said, his voice trembling, "you have to leave. Now." But I didn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my mind racing. The SUV's engine hummed steadily, its presence oppressive. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. their face obscured by the rain and the hood of a dark jacket. They moved with an unsettling calm, their boots splashing softly against the wet pavement. "Mr. Reeves," the figure said, their voice smooth and unnervingly polite. "Let's not make this any more difficult than it needs to be." Mark inhaled sharply, his hands shaking. I stepped in front of him instinctively, my body a barrier between him and the stranger. "He's not going anywhere," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. The figure tilted their head slightly, as though amused. "I'm afraid this isn't your concern. Step aside." 2 more figures emerged from the SUV, their movements precise and methodical. They flanked the first, their postures relaxed but menacing. Mark whispered behind me, his voice barely audible. "Don't do this, Lily. Please, just go." But I stayed rooted in place, my pulse thundering as the 3 figures closed the distance. One of them reached for Mark's chair, and I slapped their hand away, adrenaline coursing through me. "Don't touch him," I snapped, my fear giving way to anger. The figure straightened, their face partially visible now. "You're making a mistake," they said coldly. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Behind the figures, in the shadows of the parking lot, another light appeared, small and faint, but unmistakable. A flashlight. "Step away," a familiar voice shouted, cutting through the rain. Julia emerged, her flashlight pointed at the figures, her phone in her other hand. The faint wail of sirens followed, growing louder by the second. The figures froze, exchanging glances. The first one sighed, a sound of mild irritation, before signaling to the others. Another time, they said quietly. Without a word, they retreated to the SUV, the vehicle roaring to life and speeding off into the storm. Julia ran over, her flashlight illuminating Mark's pale face. "Are you two okay?" she asked, her voice breathless. Mark didn't respond. He was shaking, his shoulders hunched as though trying to make himself smaller. I placed a hand on his arm, my own fear giving way to a surge of protectiveness. "This isn't over," I said quietly, looking toward the empty space where the SUV had been. Not even close. The storm raged outside, thunder rolling through the sky like distant cannon fire. Inside the dimly lit corridor, I pushed Mark's wheelchair as quickly and quietly as I could. The emergency lights flickered, casting jittery shadows that made every corner feel alive. My pulse pounded in my ears, each heartbeat a drumbeat of urgency. Mark's breathing was shallow and erratic, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if anchoring himself. Behind us, faint footsteps echoed, deliberate and unhurried. Whoever was following wasn't in a rush. They didn't need to be. "Faster," Mark whispered, his voice taut with panic. "I'm trying," I hissed, my hands slick on the cold handles of the wheelchair. We rounded a corner, and I spotted the door to the supply closet. I pushed it open and maneuvered Mark inside, barely able to squeeze in myself. The space was cramped and smelled of disinfectant and cardboard. The metal shelving pressed against my back, digging into my shoulders as I struggled to pull the door shut without making a sound. The air was stifling, thick with the scent of rubber gloves and cleaning solution. Mark's legs brushed against mine, his body trembling. In the oppressive silence, I could hear everything. The faint hum of the emergency lights, the distant roll of thunder, and, most terrifying of all, the sound of footsteps growing louder. Mark's eyes met mine in the faint glow from the sliver of light beneath the door. He didn't speak, but the fear etched into his face said everything. The footsteps paused just outside. My heart stopped, the silence more deafening than any sound. A hand brushed the doorknob. It rattled slightly, and I instinctively pressed my weight against the door, holding my breath. After a moment, the footsteps moved on, fading into the distance. I exhaled shakily, my lungs burning. Mark leaned his head back against the wall, his body slack with exhaustion. "Not yet," I whispered, signaling for him to stay quiet. We waited another agonizing minute before I opened the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. "This way," I said, pushing the wheelchair back into the corridor. We made our way to the loading dock, every creak of the wheels feeling like a shout in the silence. The metal door loomed ahead, and my fingers trembled as I swiped the keycard. For a second, I thought it wouldn't work, but then the lock clicked open, and we slipped into the night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was sharp and cold. The lot stretched out before us, puddles glistening under the flickering light of a single street lamp. Mark gestured toward a narrow alley. "This way," he said, his voice hoarse. The motel came into view after a few blocks. A squat, boxy building with a faded neon sign that buzzed faintly against the night. The word vacancy flickered, half the letters barely visible. The parking lot was mostly empty, a few cars scattered like abandoned toys. Mark handed me a key as we reached the stairs. "Room 203, he said, his tone flat. The stairs creaked beneath us, each step echoing in the quiet. The second floor smelled faintly of mildew and stale air. The door to room 203 was chipped, the paint peeling around the edges. Inside, the room was dim and unwelcoming. A single overhead light buzzed faintly, casting a yellowish hue over the worn carpet and threadbare curtains. Mark wheeled himself to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer outside. The faint glow of the neon sign painted his face in sickly colors. "It's not much," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It's safe," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. He nodded, his hands resting limply in his lap. His face was pale, drawn, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of whatever he was carrying. "I didn't want this," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Didn't want what?" Mark hesitated, his gaze fixed on the rain streaking the window. "Any of it. The deals, the partnerships. I thought I could handle it, thought I could outsmart them. But Grayson, he doesn't forgive. He doesn't forget." "What happened?" I asked softly, pulling a chair closer. "I broke a deal," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "We were supposed to partner on a project, a major merger. But I found out what he was planning. It wasn't just business, it was extortion, blackmail, worse. I backed out, took the deal to someone else, and he didn't take it well, I guessed." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement. He lost everything and blamed me for it. Now he's making sure I lose everything too." The sound of a car pulling into the lot made us both freeze. Mark rolled back from the window, his face pale. I moved to the curtain, peeking out to see the black SUV parked below. "They found us," he whispered. Two figures stepped out of the vehicle, their movements deliberate. One carried a phone, his face illuminated briefly by the screen. "Lily," Mark said urgently, grabbing my arm. "You need to leave." "I'm not leaving you," I said firmly. Before he could argue, a knock sounded at the door. It was sharp, commanding. "Mark Reeves," a voice called. "We know you're in there. Open the door and no one gets hurt." Mark's breathing quickened, his grip on my arm tightening. "Please," he whispered. Another knock, louder this time. "Last chance," the voice said, more insistent. The room seemed to close in around us, the air thick with tension. Mark's eyes locked on mine, filled with something I hadn't seen before. Acceptance. "Lily," he said quietly, "whatever happens, you have to promise me you'll get out." Before I could respond, the door splintered open. The door exploded inward with a splintering crack, wood and metal scattering across the room. The sharp noise rang in my ears as two men stormed inside, their movements purposeful and controlled. The taller one carried a gun, its dark barrel gleaming ominously in the dim motel light. The shorter man's eyes scanned the room, locking onto Mark with predatory precision. Mark instinctively wheeled himself back, the legs of the chair scraping against the floor. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow and uneven. The tension in his hands was so tight that I feared he might crush the armrests. "Mr. Reeves," the taller man said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. He lifted the gun slightly, not pointing it but letting its presence speak for itself. "You've made this harder than it needed to be." Mark's lips parted, but no words came out. His terror seemed to paralyze him, freezing him in place. "Let's not waste time," the shorter man added, stepping closer. His leather jacket squeaked faintly with the movement, the smell of rain and cigarettes wafting in with him. "You know why we're here?" I moved without thinking, placing myself between Mark and the men. My heart pounded, my pulse roaring in my ears, but I held my ground. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever Grayson told you." "Don't say his name," the shorter man interrupted, his tone sharp. He sneered, leaning slightly forward. "This isn't about what we have to do. It's about what he wants." The taller man exhaled, clearly impatient. "Lady, step aside. You don't want to get hurt." "I'm not moving," I replied, clenching my fists at my sides. My knees felt like jelly, but I stood firm. "Brave," the shorter man muttered, rolling his eyes. "Pointless, but brave." Mark finally found his voice, though it was weak and shaking. "Leave her alone. This is between me and him." The taller man tilted his head, the faintest smile curling his lips. "That's where you're wrong. Everyone you drag into this becomes part of the game." A faint sound outside, footsteps, hurried and purposeful, made the men tense. Their eyes darted toward the door, their postures stiffening. The tension in the room thickened as we all listened, the muffled clamor of boots and faint voices growing louder. "Police," the taller man said flatly. "We've been made." "Doesn't matter," the shorter one replied, stepping toward Mark. "Let's finish it now." The door burst open again, this time with a thunderous crash. Uniformed officers flooded the room, their voices sharp and commanding. "Drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them." The taller man hesitated, his knuckles whitening around the grip of the gun. The moment stretched, the air charged with the possibility of violence. Finally, he let the weapon fall to the floor, its metallic clatter breaking the silence. The shorter man raised his hands, scowling as an officer pinned him against the wall. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "You don't know what you're interfering with." The officers ignored him, moving with practiced precision. One of them crouched by the gun, securing it in an evidence bag, while another handcuffed the taller man. The room, once electric with danger, now felt cold and hollow. I backed against the wall, my legs trembling beneath me. The adrenaline that had kept me standing drained away, leaving a dizzying void in its place. My gaze fell to Mark, who hadn't moved since the officers entered. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he were staring through the scene in front of him. "Are you hurt?" one of the officers asked, his voice cutting through the haze. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. Another officer crouched beside Mark, speaking softly. "Sir, you're safe now. They're in custody." Mark didn't respond. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair, his knuckles stark against his pale skin. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing shallow and uneven. I moved to his side, crouching down to meet his gaze. "Mark," I said softly, placing a hand on his knee. "It's over. They can't hurt you." His eyes slowly focused on mine, the wild panic in them dimming slightly. He exhaled, a shuddering sound that seemed to empty him entirely. "It's never over," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The officers led the men out of the room, their boots heavy against the creaky floor. As they passed, the shorter one smirked, leaning slightly toward Mark. "You'll never be safe," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Grayson doesn't forget." The officer at his side shoved him forward. "Move." Mark sagged in his chair, his head bowing as though the words had sapped the last of his strength. I stayed beside him, my hand steady on his shoulder, though my own mind was spinning. The days that followed were a blur of police statements and security arrangements. Mark was placed under protective custody, whisked away to a safe location known only to a select few. I returned to my work at Oakwood, but nothing felt normal. The quiet halls and familiar routines couldn't drown out the memories of that night or the lingering sense of unease. One afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelope was plain, the handwriting neat but unfamiliar. Inside, a single piece of cream-colored paper held a short message. "Lily, thank you for everything. I wish things had been different, but you gave me a chance I didn't deserve. Be safe, *." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I traced the careful strokes of the ink, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and something close to hope. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, knowing I'd read it again when the weight of the past felt too heavy. Mark's story wasn't over, and neither was the shadow Grayson had cast over his life. But for now, we had survived, and sometimes survival was enough.